Hi, my name is Bill McBride and I'm the SQF Asia Pacific representative. So welcome to our session on visualizing food safety culture. As we've developed edition 9, we've had some stakeholder questions about food safety culture. What is the SQF expectation of food safety culture in the edition 9 codes, and what will the auditor be looking for? Joining me today to provide a practical insight into food safety culture is Betty Murie from Wedderspoon Organics in New Zealand. But before I introduce Betty, what do we mean by food safety culture and where do we find it in the edition 9 codes? This is the GFSI definition of food safety culture and applies to all the GFSI benchmark schemes. Shared values, beliefs, and norms that affect mindset and behavior towards food safety in, across, and throughout an organization. Elements of food safety culture are those elements of the food safety management system which the senior management of a company may use to drive food safety culture within the company. These may include, but are not limited to, communication about food safety policies and responsibilities, training, employee feedback and food safety related issues, and performance measurement. GFSI came out with their white paper on food safety culture in 2018. It placed emphasis on the essential role of leaders and managers throughout an organization, from the CEO to senior managers to middle line managers within the organization. Why regular communication, education, metrics, and teamwork and personal accountability are vital to advancing a food safety culture, and how learned skills, including adaptability and hazard awareness, move important safe food practices beyond a theoretical conversation to live in real time. GFSI has also included a set of appendices that offer guidance across the food safety culture maturation process. In other words, the journey to foster culture and change from both within the organization and across the organization. In edition 9, we have included reference to food safety culture. In the food safety policy area in 2.1.1.1, we have mentioned as a sub-element, establish and maintain a food safety culture within the site. But more importantly, we've added a new element across all the SQF food safety codes in 2.1.1.2, which states that senior site management shall lead and support a food safety culture within the site that ensures, at a minimum, firstly, the establishment, documentation, and communication of all relevant staff of food safety objectives and performance measures. Secondly, adequate resources are available to meet food safety objectives. Food safety practices and all applicable requirements of the SQF system are adopted and maintained. Staff are informed and held accountable for their food safety and regulatory responsibilities. Staff are positively encouraged and required to notify management of actual or potential food safety issues. And lastly, but importantly, staff are empowered to act to resolve food safety issues within their scope of work. But what does that mean? What does it mean in practical terms within your site, whether you're progressing along the food safety culture journey or just starting on that journey? To join me in answering those questions is Betty Murie, the Global Compliance Manager for Wedderspoon Organic in New Zealand, based in New Zealand, but covers the US and Canada as well. With over 20 years international experience in compliance management, as well as international standards compliance in automotive, food contact packaging, and food across the United States and New Zealand, Betty currently specializes in the apiculture industry, and I should point out that Wedderspoon Organic is the home of Manuka honey, the world famous Manuka honey, and the legitimate Manuka honey. So she specializes in the apiculture industry, but consults across the New Zealand primary and processing food industries. Welcome, Betty, to our conversation today.
Thank you, Bill.
My first question to you, Betty, is what does food safety culture mean in practical terms?
So, in practical terms, food safety culture means that everyone understands and shares the same mission and values in the organization, but they're also all committed to making positive changes necessary to make safe and suitable food, but they also hold themselves accountable to the shared vision of safe food. So it takes a tremendous amount of communication across all levels of the business, from the front line all the way up to the board of directors, for there to be a food safety culture.
So if I'm starting off on food safety culture within my organization, what impact will food safety culture have on my business? Is it just a fad? Is it just something that I need to introduce because SQF says so? Or will it have a real impact on my business?
It will definitely have a real impact on your business, and whilst obviously individual impacts will vary across different organizations, there are a few real examples that we can share. So for an example, with a positive food safety culture in place, a business will find that there's risk reduction as the behavior across the business is proactive, it's aligned, and it's consistent, most importantly. So employees become well trained, they become proficient at their jobs and at their tasks, and this in turn will result in waste reduction across the organization. This will also help with operational efficiencies and innovations because staff are going to be empowered and excited, and they're going to share their ideas on improvements to both the process and the system. Another example is that businesses will experience an improved morale and motivation because employees are going to have better job satisfaction because they feel part of an effective team that works well together. So your turnover is going to reduce because employees feel valued. And again, another positive example of impact is, depending upon the regulatory framework of your country, a positive food safety culture could also result in a decrease in the prescribed frequency of your regulatory audits and inspections because the business is then deemed as a proactive complier or a leader in regulatory food safety, which satisfies those regulatory requirements and therefore are deemed a lower risk than non-compliers. And so therefore your overall audit and costs related to that reduce from a regulatory standpoint.
So, so as a business starting out on this journey, I've had SQF in place for a number of years. I've been SQF certified. I've had good scores. But how do I get started on the food safety culture journey?
So, looking at that, you need to look at the 5 pillars, and first of all, critically assess where you are in terms of vision and mission. So does your business have a vision and mission statements? Do your staff know it? But most importantly, do they understand your vision and mission statements? The second part of that pillar is to look at the people within your organization. How much are you investing as a business in training? How much are you investing in positive reinforcement of positive behaviors that you want to encourage? You also need to think about consistency and accountability in the business. So how do you communicate in your business, and what are you communicating? And again, are you communicating with everyone? So it's very easy when you have a one-shift organization to ensure that you're communicating with everyone. But if you're a multi-shift organization, how are you ensuring that the people on the night shift are getting the same message as the people on the day shift? And you have to make sure that everyone in the organization is aware of their responsibilities and their accountabilities. So, things like, are staff given specific personal objectives for their accountability? And are both positive and negative consequences for actions taken? So, looking critically at your business, and is the business only punishing negative behavior, but you're not rewarding the positive behavior that you want to encourage and support? You also need to understand the level of awareness and ownership that exists within your organization. So are your staff positively engaged? And is there evidence that information provided through your training or toolbox meetings is retained. And that's key and that's critical. We'll talk more about that later. But you also need to look at staff understanding of the hazards and the risks that relate to their specific areas of the business and how they can control those. And most importantly for me is, do staff show pride and ownership of their areas and tasks? So, if you're seeing pride in their work, then you're on your way to a positive food safety culture. You also need to consider the adaptability of your organization. So, as we are all very much aware, this has been a year where all industries globally have had to react to major changes. So, looking critically at how agile our businesses are in changing circumstances, or again in a crisis, looking at, does your business have a forward plan, and do you have existing continuity plans in place, but are they known and are they understood in the business? So once you look at these 5 areas, which are the 5 pillars of the food safety culture as you discussed earlier, there needs to be a discussion by the senior leadership of the business on where the business is in reality and where they desire the business to be on the journey. Then it's important to plan and develop this plan for change management and implement it in a manner that allows it to become embedded within the business to become the new normal. And it's not going to happen overnight, because as we know, change takes time. So you have to prepare for this to be a long-term journey and to ensure that there's a frequent review of the resources and the progress that you've made, and ensuring that you're going in the direction that you want to go to, but to make sure that you celebrate the successes of the journey along the way.
Thanks, Betty, and we'll come back to the leadership question in a couple of moments. But before that, you mentioned that this is a long-term journey. Does it end? Is there a finishing point? Is there somewhere we can say, yes, we've got that, we've got food safety culture, we can now move on?
So whilst you may get to where you desire as a business, the journey is not a finite journey. It's not, yay, we've reached the finish line and we're done. The challenge then shifts from the progress on your journey to how do we maintain where we are, or how do we improve? Because business conditions can change, and they can change very quickly, as we've all experienced this year. And there are both positive and negative changes, and this will impact your journey. So for an example, if your business grows, you're going to have new people to bring along this journey. And so you're going to have to take them from where they are to where the business is. And that, again, is a change, and that's still another journey, though it's still not finite. And conversely, if your industry has a downturn for whatever reason, you have to look at how you maintain the positive food safety culture that you've got in place when the morale might understandably be affected across your organization.
You mentioned leadership before, Betty, in one of the previous answers, and leadership's obviously important in this. So what does leadership look like within a site? What does management commitment look like? What is the importance, the relevance, the role of senior management in implementing food safety culture?
So management commitment is the cornerstone of food safety culture. And if you don't have management commitment, it's really difficult to engage this journey. But what it looks like is active participation in creating and maintaining that positive food safety culture. So there can be tangible evidence of this commitment through, for example, multiple documented sources of communication across your business, that you have evidence that training is both budgeted in terms of finances, that the company is putting financial resource into training for all levels of staff, as well as budgeting for that time and allowing that time that's necessary for that training. But there's also intangible evidence, and we're going to talk a lot about tangible versus intangible evidence around food safety culture. And intangible evidence of management commitment is seen through attitude. So positive attitudes toward food safety. And it's not exhibiting the behavior of, we have to do this because it's required, or we have to do this because SQF says so. It's actually quite a passion, a drive, an engagement with food safety culture, that we're doing this because it's the right thing to do. And it also looks like support and engagement of ideas of staff, and actively listening to feedback from staff on a number of areas. So these are ways that management commitment is evidenced through tangible and intangible means.
I want to come back to senior management and management commitment in a moment, because obviously it's critical, and as you say, it's key to the implementation. But you also mentioned multiple documented avenues of communication there, and I just wanted to know what you meant by that. What do you mean? Obviously, you said before, communications is very important, but when you talk about documented avenues of communication, what do you mean by that?
So obviously, we have a saying within food safety: if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So looking at evidence of, say, toolbox meetings, or, staff meetings, or, is there, for an example, some businesses have a rolling news kind of television of announcements and things within the business. So these are all avenues of participation. Do you have a notice board? Do you have things up on the notice board? So these are all both, electronic and written areas in which staff have access to the documented communication that's happened. But it's also very much important that they're involved and engaged within the meetings themselves, not just reading the minutes afterwards. But the minutes afterwards are the evidence of the culture taking place.
So what if you don't have that? We don't all have proactive, active, positive senior managers. Sometimes they're driven by other requirements within the business or by head office. So if you don't have, if we as SQF practitioners think there is a lack of management support, what do we do? How do we get started? How do we develop this journey?
So first of all, taking a step back from that question and looking at whether or not the site has made that commitment to a food safety culture. If there has been that commitment made, then it is implicit that everyone in the organization is responsible and accountable for their part of that journey for a positive food safety culture. So then moving forward to the question, if this is not being fulfilled, taking a step back and looking at it from a courageous conversation standpoint, trying to understand the other person. So attempt to understand why that there's a lack of management support. So is this stemming from a lack of understanding of food safety culture? So that could be a big part of it, is that they themselves don't quite understand what food safety culture is and their role in this. And that could be causing that perceived lack of support because they have a gap in their knowledge. You can also look at generational or cultural issues that are at play that we need to bridge to ensure that there's understanding and that there is a means to helping bring them into that journey with us. So again, looking at it from that courageous conversation viewpoint, once you have critically assessed what you feel is the reasons, is this something that you yourself could have a direct conversation with that specific individual? Or do you feel that there's assistance needed from higher within the organization? So again, keeping in mind that if the organization has committed to food safety culture, we have to show that there is support both at the site management level and at the corporate management level. So if you're seeing that there's a lack of management support at the site level, then your next avenue is to discuss this with the corporate level and saying we need some more information, we need some more support because we have some gaps here, and in order to progress this journey, we need everyone on board with us.
I'd like to stay with this for a moment, if that's okay, Betty, because I guess this is the key question that a lot of SQF practitioners ask, because courageous conversations can be career limiting, as you well know. So it's sometimes hard, and we've heard this before in other areas, where senior managers might sign off on food safety culture because it's something they have to do as part of the SQF code, but actually participating or doing it would be another issue. So is there any more advice you can give on to SQF practitioners on how to move forward where there is an apparent lack of management commitment to proceeding with food safety culture?
So we'll talk about it a bit later in this piece, but one of the things that I would suggest is before there is a commitment made to having a positive food safety culture, is for those who are decision makers, i.e., your leadership team, that they go on it can be a short course for food safety culture, so that they get that burst of reality, if you will, before any commitment is made, before any decisions are made as a business, so that they go in fully understanding what the expectations are. And, as part of that journey for your food safety culture, it can be an agreement that within the organization, if they feel that someone is not, fully committing, that there's a group that has that discussion with the individual. So it's not just one person, as you said, that can be career limiting, and I absolutely understand that. But again, there has to be accountability, and there has to be a responsibility for the part that they play within that food safety culture. And if that's not being met, then it is the responsibility of those higher in the organization to ensure that that behavior is changed, or there is a different change within the organization to precede the food safety culture.
Good, thank you for that. And we'll come back to that question as we move forward. But that's senior management. What about the rest of us? How do you empower staff at various levels of the organization to get involved and participate in food safety culture?
So the key foundation of empowerment is effective training. So you have to have effective training where information is retained. So if training is happening, but your staff aren't retaining anything from the training that's taken place, you're not actually benefiting your organization, and you're not giving them the tools that they need to be empowered. So there has to be a commitment to continued professional development, which means that staff will stay on the leading edge of technology, of information, and of innovation, which will then get reinvested back into the business in a number of ways. But beyond training, there has to be an assurance that responsibilities and accountabilities are clear to staff at all levels of the organization. So that way they understand what's expected of them. They understand what they are responsible for within their scope of work, and what the accountabilities that they're being held to. But where possible, giving them autonomy over these tasks will very much increase their sense of empowerment, because they are able to make those decisions on their day-to-day tasks. But obviously, you have to look at constructive feedback, and the other side of constructive feedback is actively listening to ideas and input from staff. And the other way that you can empower them is when they provide these ideas, that you involve them in the implementation, because that is powerful. If they have an idea that they feel is going to be for the betterment of the organization, and you give them the tools and the opportunity to be part of that implementation process, then they feel valued, they feel empowered, and they feel as if they're a big part of that process. The other sides of things that we can do to empower staff is recognizing accomplishments. And I can't underscore that one enough, that, if you continue to do the right thing and you're not recognized for it, after a while, people innately begin to question, why am I doing this? And so when they feel recognized, they continue to want to perform at that level. But the main focus of empowerment is around communication. And I say, we have to communicate. And that's all avenues of communication. That's communication from management down, and that's communication from staff up. So when everyone is communicating and actively listening to each other as a proper two-way street, then everyone within that organization is feeling empowered and doing the right thing.
You mentioned training before, and we're already doing that. We're already doing training within the organization. Everyone who comes in is trained in their particular tasks, given the appropriate skills. But what kind of training are you talking about? What kind of training is involved, and at what levels within the organization?
So training is required across all levels of the organization. But it is most effective when it relates directly to the specific role of the person being trained. So it's not just the what, it's the how. How do I apply this in my day-to-day? So some training, especially for the front line, also needs to be followed up with skills assessment or some other means to ensure that the training's understood and that's being applied correctly. So that's what we talk about, that information retention, and that's critical to training. You can be doing training all the time, but if it's not effective and the information's not being retained, there's no point to the training. So we need to ensure that the training that's being conducted is actually effective and benefiting both the trainee and the business. So obviously training is going to look very different across your organization at different levels. So your procurement manager's training for his or her role around the tasks that relate to food safety is going to look very different from the training that your production supervisor is going to need in order to understand how their role impacts food safety. And whilst external training is very helpful to cover topics like food hygiene, sanitation, fundamentals of HACCP, your internal training needs to be specific, targeted, effective to the audience. So the best means of doing that is making it very task specific of how this affects their role in the organization.
Betty, you mentioned before that food safety culture is intangible, and you've mentioned, intangible and tangible benefits. How do you meet those requirements? How do you measure progress with food safety culture?
So you're quite right that food safety culture in and of itself, it's behavioral focus, so it's intangible, but there are tangible things that we can measure that are the result of the intangible behavioral aspects. So we can use these to track our progress on our journey. So if we go back to those 5 pillars that we've discussed earlier on starting the journey, each of these have tangible components that we can measure. So for an example, looking at our vision and our mission, we can have a measure around the effectiveness of our internal communication and how well things are being understood, how much we communicate, and the means that we're communicating. Looking at our people. So again, this has a tangible aspect in terms of training. So what training has taken place against your training plan? So that's a very black and white measurement of this is the amount of training that we wanted to undertake this year, and this is where we're at against that plan. Looking at assessments or surveys post-training, this again is a tangible measurement of how effective the training was and therefore where you're at in that people aspect of the food safety culture. Looking at consistency, looking forward to your original plan that you had laid out for your journey. Where are you at in terms of that original plan? Is this where you said you'd be halfway through by this point because you've put the resources into it, but the reality is that you're a quarter of a way where you thought you'd be? So that's a tangible measurement around your consistency. You can also look at it in terms of non-conformances. So looking at the non-conformances that were raised in your organization within the same time frame, say the previous year or the previous 5 years, and comparing that to where you are now. And a further analysis of that would be looking specifically at your non-conformances that relate to food safety risks, because as your organization progresses on this positive food safety culture journey, as we talked about, there will be empowerment, there will be reduction in waste. So you should be seeing those nonconformances decreasing as a result of these intangible concepts taking place. Looking at awareness and ownership. So as an example, if you have an ideas program, are you tracking the receipt of the ideas from your staff? But most importantly, are you looking at the actioning of these ideas and tracking how the originator of the idea is having active participation within the implementation of this idea? So again, tangible, evidential measurements around awareness and ownership. And lastly, adaptability. So looking at what has not gone according to plan, because things don't go to plan all the time. So that's talking about, any recalls, any withdrawals, supplier operational continuity issues, or verification failures. So looking at your responses to these events and looking at who was included in the response. So, previously in, the last year before you started on this journey, it may have only been senior management who was involved within the responses. But within a positive food safety culture, you would be involving everyone within this and getting their ideas and actions on moving forward to respond to these kinds of events.
I mean, that's fine, Betty, but I mean, some of these measures don't really impact the bottom line, do they? I mean, they're intangible, as you indicated. They're a little bit subjective, maybe, but how do they impact the bottom line? How do they tie into the other KPIs that may happen within the site?
So, other existing KPIs within your organization that you may already be measuring have an intangible link to food safety culture, because again, behavioral circumstances affect your key performance indicators. So examples of a few measurements that are affected by food safety culture: capacity utilization, compliance rates, decrease in downtime, production efficiency or increase in productivity, however you measure that, a decrease in scrap and rework costs, again, are all KPIs that are tied into food safety culture, as well as quality improvement, reduction in customer complaints. These are all areas that have links into food safety culture. So the positive food safety culture has a direct impact on these KPIs because they're affecting all areas of the business, albeit through the intangible behavioral changes that are happening within the business.
So we're talking about food safety culture here, which is really organizational culture within food manufacturing or food business. But what's worked in other industries? What has worked in terms of what are the examples of organizational change that's been effective in other industry sectors?
So, taking this outside of food industry, as you've rightly called out, it's organizational management, organizational change. We can gain great insights into what works to build a fantastic company culture. And then we can take that step to integrate food safety into that. So in July 2019, Glassdoor did a study that cited the top aspect that most led to employee satisfaction. And it was that the workplace had a clear mission that connected employees' daily tasks to broader social purpose and positive change. And this is at the heart of food safety culture as a clear mission for our businesses. So when we look at the top business performers in overall culture, it's not about employee perks. As some people would think, oh, well, they have a great break room, or they have, parties every week. It's not about those kinds of perks. What they found is that these top performers in culture have strong diversity. They have respect among all levels of the organization. They encourage participation from all employees, and they're very transparent. And these are all fundamental ingredients of a positive food safety culture that can be applied within our own journeys. I know that people will be interested in reading more of this. So we'll make sure that there are links to the research by Glassdoor. And there's a fantastic article around the top business performers from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, so that they can get more information and more ideas on what other businesses outside of food industries are doing to foster and maintain their business culture, which then can be applied to food safety culture.
Betty, you mentioned the Glassdoor study. What other information is available that people who are watching, that SQF practitioners can gain to help them get started or continue on their food safety culture journey?
So the GFSI white paper is a fantastic source of information to get started because it gives you that background, and it gives you the basics around what the expectations are around a food safety culture. So that's a great starting point. But looking at support, reality, and ideas, they also have some stories around food safety culture on their YouTube channel that's called GFSI YouTube, that are well worth watching, because they have stories of businesses who went, we wanted to have a positive food safety culture, and this is what we did, and this is our journey, and this is where we're at now. So these are really great idea generation methods of gleaning what worked for others within the food industry. There's also a number of blog posts and articles, which again, we'll provide a link to a few of these. But if you go into the SQFI website and you type in the keyword culture and do a search, you'll find these quite quickly around what works in food safety culture, and just general conversations around this. But again, looking at training, there's a number of training facilities and providers globally that provide short courses on food safety culture. And as I mentioned earlier around management commitment, these shorter courses are fantastic first steps for the decision makers in the organizations to take before they're making any decisions or any commitment to food safety culture, so that there is a realization of what it entails and helps them to understand what the picture is, what resources are needed, and what the journey will look like for your organization.
I mentioned a number of key words throughout this presentation. You've talked about employee empowerment, you've talked about communication, positive communication. The terms constructive, positive, proactive have come through in your presentation. I want to look at the inclusion of food safety culture in the Edition 9 code in 2.1.1.2, and why SQF considers it a mandatory element. I mean, I'll share the SQF viewpoint, but what's your take on it? What do you see as the expectations of 2.1.1.2 in the Edition 9 codes?
So my take is that the expectation is to show that your site is on the journey, not that you finish the journey, or that there's an expectation that you're X amount of percentage through, but that you're on that journey and you have evidence that you're on that journey. So again, it's showing that commitment from both site management and corporate management, and providing evidence of those tangible measurements that we've given some examples of. So that's what I feel that the expectation of this section of the code is relating to, is that you have evidence that you're on the journey, not that you have a conclusion or a destination.
That is going to be difficult for sites and for auditors, isn't it? Because it's not binary, it's not black and white, it's not you've got it or you haven't got it. It is a journey, and we'll come back to that. This is what we see, SQFI sees as our expectations of 2.1.1.2. That there is senior corporate, and Betty's touched on that, and site management commitment and involvement and participation in establishing a food safety culture, and not just complying with this element of the SQF code. I should also mention that we don't just see food safety culture as in 2.1.1.2. We see food safety culture as embedded throughout the SQF code. We're looking to see that the organization and the site, so that's the corporate organization if applicable and the site, understands the current status of its food safety culture through some of the measures that Betty has talked about, through reviews, through surveys, through communication, through results. The organization's belief and values are shared and known and understood within the site. It's not just something that's in their employee handbook or is on the wall in the reception area. It's something that is understood in languages understood within the site. There's a program in place to positively reinforce attitudes and behaviors. There's open communication of food safety objectives and performance measures, the tangible measures. There's positive employee encouragement and involvement. There's employee empowerment within their scope of work, full empowerment within their scope of work, and they understand where their scope of work fits within the overall scope of work. And there is integration, and Betty touched on this as well, across all facets of the business. It's not just limited to the manufacturing area, to the processing area, to the technical group. It's right across the site. It's right across the organization. And there is continual review, measurement, and revision of the food safety program as it moves forward. I also need to point out that in some of the stakeholder comments, the public consultation feedback has been that this is a new element. It's not. Most of the sub-elements within 2.1.1.2 are not new. They've already been in the Edition 8 code or the Edition 8.1 code. So 1 to 5, sub-elements 1 to 5 have been are in 2.1.1.1 through to 2.1.2.7 in the existing Edition 8 code. The only one that is new is staff are empowered to act to resolve food safety issues within their scope of work. Is new within the Edition 9 code. Everything else is just a carryover from the various elements in the Edition 8 and the 8.1 codes. Why is it a mandatory element? Why is 2.1.1.2 a mandatory element? Because it's important. SQF feels it's important. It's important within all the GFSI benchmarked CPOs, and it's certainly important within ours. We see the difference between an effective, workable food safety management system and an ineffective system is the organizational culture and how that influences the attitudes and behaviors within the business. As Betty indicated before, it reflects the intangible measures within the organization that translate into tangible benefits and tangible KPIs within the organization as it progresses. And the key question, what will the auditor be looking for as evidence of food safety culture? Because again, auditors are looking for, yes, you comply, or no, you don't comply. It's either a minor, a major, or, well, it's certainly not going to be a critical non-conformance, hopefully. But what we're asking auditors to do is to consider it as a journey, not a destination. And Betty has touched on this a number of times during the presentation. That it's not a case of just starting on it and hoping you get there. It is a journey, and it's a continuous improvement journey. It's change management, it's continuous improvement. The auditor is not looking for perfect. The auditor is auditing the journey. And this is what we're asking certification bodies and auditors to do. It is, you're looking at behavioral aspects. You're looking at attitudes, not just whether something is black or white, whether it's in or it's out, whether it complies or doesn't comply. We're asking the auditors to establish that there is a positive program in place that reinforces positive attitudes and behaviors, and they are encouraged within the organization. That the organizational values and beliefs are there for a start, they exist, and that they're shared and understood within the organization. There is positive employee empowerment and engagement. We're looking for a carrot rather than a stick approach. Positive empowerment leads to staff ownership of their work areas and leads to improvements within those areas. And there is evidence of continuous improvement, ongoing review, and improvement of their food safety culture. We don't consider it as a program, we consider it as part of the SQF system, as part of the food safety management system, and part of the organizational, that is embedded in the organizational functions moving forward. So we have an opportunity for questions, and Betty and I will be around here to answer your questions as we move forward. So Betty, thank you for your input, for your participation, and we look forward to some questions coming in from the live Q&A.